Hello, and welcome to another edition of America's Godly Heritage. Did you know that George Washington was not only the first president of the United States, but he was also the president in another position that was of paramount importance to this fledgling nation? Stay tuned and find out more about El Presidente, George Washington. But first, America's Godly Heritage needs your support. All you have to do is click on the like and the subscribe or follow buttons. Every click helps since we are a small enterprise. Thank you. Now, in today's episode, we're going to be continuing a series about the U.S. Constitution. Even though God is not directly named in the Constitution, His fingerprints are all over it. In the first episode, we discussed how the founders intended the Declaration of Independence, which mentions God 4 times, and the Constitution to go hand in hand. In the second episode, we looked at the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union, which was our nation's first governing document. Since the Articles proved to be too weak to be effectual, in May 1787, delegates from across the country, except Rhode Island, gathered in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to try to fix them. George Washington, one of the most important people in the new United States, had to be convinced to attend this vitally important convention. You see, after the Revolutionary War, Washington had had enough of the stresses and strains of leadership, and he had resigned his commission and retired to Mount Vernon, where he intended to spend the rest of his life running his plantation. However, he often had visitors, and he corresponded with many with whom he discussed political issues and current events. Thus, he was aware of the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation and the significant problems arising from them. When it was decided to hold a convention to remedy the deficiencies of the Articles, the Virginia legislature selected Washington as a delegate, but he didn't plan on attending. He wanted to remain a retired gentleman. He was also concerned that people would view tampering with the Articles of Confederation as an attempt to grab power, and he didn't want his honorable reputation to be tarnished. However, he reluctantly allowed others, most notably James Madison and General Henry Knox, to persuade him to attend the convention. Washington had earned the nation's trust and respect through his excellent leadership and noble character during the Revolutionary War. Therefore, the delegates needed him to play a central role at the convention for the public to accept the radical changes they were going to make. In short, America was in such a mess, it needed Washington to come out of retirement. And Washington felt it was his duty to help the nation once again. After writing to Governor Edmund Randolph agreeing to be one of the Virginia representatives at the convention, Washington wrote to James Madison, in part to share his view of the upcoming conference. He wrote, "I'm glad to find that Congress have recommended to the states to appear in the convention proposed to be held, in Philadelphia in May. It is idle, in my opinion, to suppose that the sovereign, by that he means Congress, can be insensible of the inadequacy of the powers under which it acts, and that seeing it should not recommend a revision of the federal system. My wish is that the convention may adopt no temporizing expedient, but probe the defects of the Constitution, and by that he meant the Articles of Confederation, to the bottom, and provide radical cures." When the convention began, the delegates' first order of business on May 14, 1787, was to unanimously choose Washington as president of the convention. In his oration upon the death of General Washington, Governor Morris relates that Washington addressed the delegates, saying, "It was probable that no plan we propose will be adopted, but if they failed, the nation might find itself in another dreadful conflict, or war." He also exhorted them to do what was best rather than doing what they thought would be popular. He said, If to please the people, we offer what we ourselves disapprove, how can we afterwards defend our work? Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. If only politicians today followed that advice. Anyway, he then concluded by reminding them of he to whom they were ultimately responsible by saying, "The event is in the hand of God." Washington was quietly but actively involved throughout the proceedings. He wore his military uniform, and he sat on a high-backed wooden chair with a sun painted on it, which was at a dais at the end of the hall. He decided all questions of order. He chose who spoke, and the delegates presented their speeches and proposals to him. As the delegates made speeches, debated, and argued, Washington remained composed and neutral. He was the embodiment of the phrase, "Keep calm and carry on." He had a gift of silence, which helped create an atmosphere that allowed the delegates to speak freely, to build bridges and make the necessary compromises, and ultimately to create a new governing document for our nation. Due to his desire to remain neutral, Washington contributed to formal debate only once, and that was when he suggested the ratio of representation be changed from 1 representative per 40,000 people to 1 per 30,000 people, so the representatives would have closer ties to their constituents. Shock and surprise, the convention approved his suggestion. By the way, as of the 2020 census, a U.S. House of Representatives member now represents an average of 761,000 constituents. That is a wee bit more than 30,000. And by the way many representatives behave, you can see that this distancing is actually a real issue. However, if the House had maintained Washington's suggested ratio of 1 per 30,000, then we would have 11,000 members of the House of Representatives today. 11,000. If you think it's difficult for Congress to get anything done right now, as is, imagine what it would be like if we had 11,000 people in the House of Representatives. Nothing would get done. While all this toing and froing was taking place and the summer slipped by, Washington wrote weekly letters to his nephew, George Augustine Washington, and requested weekly reports from him concerning Mount Vernon. Every aspect of the plantation was discussed, from wondering if the poor carrot and parsnip crops were due to the effect of bad seed, to making sure the mortar for bricks was well needed, to wishing Mount Vernon was sharing some of Philadelphia's abundant rain. Though his head was in Pennsylvania, clearly, this formerly retired gentleman planter's heart was back in Virginia. One important and controversial issue addressed by the convention concerned the concept of a federal executive branch which would implement and enforce the laws created by the legislative branch. The executive branch didn't exist under the Articles of Confederation, so the executive functions were carried out, or at least attempted, by a weak 13-member committee that was often ignored by the states. However, in June 1787, the framers of the Constitution set out to change all of this by creating an executive branch that was separate from, but equal to, the legislative branch. While they liked the idea of having an empowered executive branch, the idea of having a single chief magistrate, or president, was a serious concern for these former colonists. They had just broken the yoke of a monarchy over them, and they were adamant they did not want another king. They feared giving one person so much power. They feared he would slowly but surely take more and more power onto himself and become a tyrant. James Madison's notes on the debates give us an example of this. Mr. Pinckney was for a vigorous executive, but was afraid the executive powers would render the executive a monarchy, of the worst kind, to wit, an elective one. In place of a single president, the delegates debated the idea of having a triumvirate, or a three-person council, like the Roman Republic had. However, as Madison's notes inform us, James Wilson pointed out, among three equal members, he foresaw nothing but uncontrolled, continued, and violent animosities, which would not only interrupt the public administration, but diffuse their poison through the other branches of government. This is a fair point, particularly since the triumvirates of Rome ended with one of the three members taking control after much bloodshed and upheaval. Wasn't a good ending. Further, Wilson opined that a single magistrate would provide the most energy, dispatch, and responsibility to the office. In addition, all of the states had a single governor, so a single president over the whole nation really was just following the state's example. Ultimately, the delegates decided to have a single president in a 7-3 vote. What made the idea of having a single president more acceptable to many of the representatives was that they already had George Washington in mind as the first president. They knew he wouldn't try to grab power for himself. He'd already had the chance to do so at the end of the War for Independence, when he was the nation's conquering hero. Yet instead of taking the opportunity to lead the country as well as the armed forces, Washington had retired. The delegates also trusted him to launch the new executive branch with wisdom and integrity, so they outlined the roles and responsibilities of the presidency with Washington in mind. They knew that as the first president, he would define the office more clearly through his decisions and actions. They knew he would set the example for all future presidents. Pierce Butler, a delegate from South Carolina, later noted in a letter to Wheaton Butler that the president's powers are full great, and greater than I was disposed to make them. Nor do I believe they would have been so great had not many of the members cast their eyes towards General Washington as president, and shaped their ideas of the powers to be given to a president by their opinions of his virtue. Once the final draft of the Constitution was completed, on September 17, 1787, it was voted upon, accepted, and signed by the delegates. George Washington signed first. The Constitution was then sent to Congress. Attached to it was a letter from Washington, the President of the Convention, to the President of Congress. The letter asked Congress to accept the necessity of a different organization. By that they meant government. He also wrote that it was the Convention's most ardent wish that the Constitution may promote the lasting welfare of that country so dear to us all, and secure her freedom and happiness. On September 28, 1787, the Congress of the Confederation unanimously resolved to send the Constitution to the state legislatures, so each could hold a ratification convention by the people according to the procedure specified in the new Constitution. Copies of the Constitution, along with George Washington's letter, were then sent to each state. Now that the Constitutional Convention had finished, Washington no longer remained neutral. He was quite vocal in his support for ratification of the new national Constitution. In his private correspondence, Washington expressed a desire to see the Constitution adopted, even though he acknowledged that it had some imperfections. For example, in a letter to Edward Newenham, Washington wrote, "For the want of a proper confederation, we have not yet been in a situation fully to enjoy those blessings which God and nature seem to have intended for us. Although there were some few things in the Constitution which did not full accord with my wishes, yet, having taken every circumstance seriously into consideration, I was convinced it approached nearer to perfection than any government hitherto instituted among men. I was also convinced that nothing but a genuine spirit of amity and accommodation could have induced the members to make those mutual concessions and to sacrifice those local prejudices which seemed to oppose an insurmountable barrier, to prevent them from harmonizing in any system whatsoever. But so it has happened by the good pleasure of Providence. And Washington also supported the Constitution publicly. He attended his own state's ratification convention, lobbying on behalf of ratification. In his observations of the Virginia ratifying convention, James Monroe noted in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, "Be assured his," by that he meant Washington's, "his influence carried the government." Washington's approval of the Constitution carried a lot of weight and helped influence the other state conventions as well. One by one, they voted yay, and ratified the new governing document. Finally, on May 29, 1790, Rhode Island, the state that had refused to attend the Constitutional Convention, voted in favor of the Constitution. Washington was most pleased by this, and he wrote to Congress, "Having received official information of the accession of the state of Rhode Island and Providence plantations to the Constitution of the United States, I take the earliest opportunity of communicating the same to you, with my congratulations on this happy event, which unites under the general government all the states which were originally confederated." The final takeaway. Looking back, the Constitutional Convention was a great success. However, it might not have been. The U.S. Constitution might not have existed at all if George Washington hadn't come out of retirement. His sense of duty that led him to lay aside what he wanted to do to serve his country, his serene leadership that promoted cooperation at the Constitutional Convention, and his noble character that led to a single president in the executive branch and promoted ratification, were all crucial to the success of the Constitution. Yet Washington made it clear that however vital a role he played, ultimately, the event is in the hand of God. Well, that's it for now. Thank you for listening to this edition of America's Godly Heritage. I hope you have a great day. Bye. Help us spread our message. Please support us through any or all of the following. 1. Clicking the like button for this podcast. 2. Becoming a forerunner and subscribing to our page on Buzzsprout or Patreon, which will sow some financial provision into our work. 3. Following us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Truth, or X. And finally, 4. Praying for us. If you want to check out the primary and secondary sources used to make this podcast, you can view them at the end of the video version, which is shown on YouTube and Patreon. We really appreciate your support. Thanks again. Bye.